Thank you, dear Emmanuel, for this very kind invitation. Thank you to the Alliance Programme and the Maison Française team for organizing this panel. I'll start with a simple question. Why did we have to write another book on French colonization? In fact, in 2021, when we spoke for the first time with the editorial team of Le Seuil Publishing House, Séverine Nickel, Julie Clarini, Patrick Boucheron, I was not immediately convinced by the relevance of such a project. Indeed, I was on the contrary devoted myself during the previous decade to the comparative and connected history of colonial empires, as evidenced, for example, by this Atlas des Empires coloniaux published in 2012, and this Les Empires coloniaux published the following year in 2013. At that time, in fact, as today, we were convinced that it is impossible to understand the history of an imperial formation without taking into consideration other empires as well as the global context. So this remark obviously applies to the history of each colony and each colonial situation. These fragments of history cannot make sense without this broadening of the scope. In these circumstances, why propose a new book on the French colonization? The first aim was to provide the general public with a presentation of the deep renewal of research on this subject over more than 30 years. And the problem lies in the gap between this great academic knowledge and the huge ignorance among the general public, both in France and in former colonies. On this ignorance, in fact, strives the growing instrumentalizations of the past. In fact, the colonial past in France is increasingly exploited by political leaders and media commentators. It is, without a doubt, the historical subject with the Second World War, which arouses the most debate and the most controversies in France, but also in the former colonies. As you can notice on this slide, numerous statements by senior state representative or politician shamelessly distort the historical truth. So in 2007, it's very well known, President Sarkozy dared to declare in front of an audience of Senegalese intellectuals and students at the Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, the African man has not entered enough into history. And my colleague Mamadou Diouf will talk about this question in a few minutes. Another notable public intervention, that of Prime Minister François Fillon, who declared in Yaoundé, Cameroon, in 2009, I absolutely denied that French forces participated in any way in an assassination in Cameroon. This is all pure invention. Among the authors of the book, the PhD student Yves Mintunge precisely documents the violent repression of the Cameroonian independence movement, and in particular the murder of the leader Ruben Oumniobé on September 13, 1958 by French troops. So no need to quote Éric Zemmour. As you can read, he's talking about a reversal of colonization. The immigrants behave like colonizer, etc. So perhaps this interpretation is not so marginal after all. In fact, this reminds me of a forgotten quote from the very brilliant historian Fernand Braudel, who worked in his youth in Algeria. While he totally ignored at that time the colonial question, when he was in Algiers, during the interwar. In fact, he wrote in 1986 in his famous book, The Identity of France, I quote him, "For the first time, I believe, on a national level, the immigrant poses for France a sort of colonial problem, this time planted within itself. So the conservatives and the far right do not have a monopoly of this type of exploitation. The left can also have a short memory, and its leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, likes to quote the great pioneer of French colonization, Richelieu: "The tears of our sovereigns have the salty taste of the sea that they ignored." And Mélenchon proudly reassures in his speeches that France has the second maritime territory in the world, while taking care not to specify that this maritime territory is a direct result of colonial conquests. More broadly, different social issues trigger controversies in France: racism, police violence, immigration, restitution of African cultural heritage, enormous socioeconomic inequalities in overseas territories, etc. And they are often interpreted in post-colonial terms. In addition, the book was published, as you said, Emmanuel, last September in a specific geopolitical context: the exacerbation of anti-French demands in sub-Saharan Africa. In several countries, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Chad, etc., demonstrators denounce the misdeeds of France-Afrique. Several contributions in the book show the extent to which France is trapped by its colonial past. Indeed, the great era of France-Afrique has been over since the late 1990s. French investments have collapsed, military bases have closed, the French government is discredited, and above all, China and Russia are much more present than France in almost all areas. But at the same time, remnants of French domination in Africa remain, such as the CFA franc or the Barkhane military operation. And in fact, the popular protests in 2023 do not signify the end of France-Afrique, but the media and very spectacular staging of the decline of French neocolonialism in the eyes of the rest of the world. So this omnipresent post-colonial news in France and abroad has led us to adopt a new approach. We had to tell the history starting from the present. Firstly, because it is the most obvious way to interest those who, a priori, do not read history books. Starting from the traces of colonization in the present, through urban landscapes, rap music, French language, economic structures, literature, etc., is undoubtedly the most stimulating entry point for the general public. It is not a simple mind game, but an historical method theorized by Marc Bloch, who invoked in the historian's craft the metaphor of the real, analyzed by the researcher. He described the present as furnishing the best point of departure for inquiry into history. Bloch spoke of the regressive method and of reading history backwards. In fact, for us, it is simply a question of reconnecting with the methodology of historians who ask questions of the present to study the past. Thus, each present poses different questions to the past. For instance, the history of gender and environmental history are more present today, and this is how historiography is continually enriched. This backwards history reminds us as well of a counterintuitive phenomenon. Most of the time, it is not the past that determines the present, but it is the present that determines the way in which we write the past. Immanuel Wallerstein was undoubtedly one of the first to draw our attention to this phenomenon. Thus, according to him, India, for instance, because he worked on this case study, India is a recent and contingent construction under British domination and through independence in 1947. And at that time, British and Indian historians strive to write a multi-millennial national history which still influences our imagination. This backwards history can also make it possible to get rid of a linear and deterministic vision of history. we had to break with the traditional history of the French colonial empire, an evolutionary narrative which tells in an anthropomorphic way the birth of the empire, its development, its peak, and its intellectual decline, and then finally its death. The book gives us the opportunity to defatalize history by restoring value to contingency, the role of individual, and also the importance of abandoned projects and unfinished experiments. This way of writing history makes it possible to highlight the recent nature of certain phenomena. Thus, contrary to what is generally thought, the spread of the French language in Africa is a post-colonial fact and not the direct product of colonial policy which educated only between 1% and 10% of children. Thus, it is a question of trying to write a non-deterministic and non-theological history of decolonization by showing, as Fred Cooper does, for example, that the players on both sides considered, long after the Second World War, other political options than the founding of an independent nation-state. As another example, classic colonial history is too often a powerful narrative filled with quick and easy conquests. On the contrary, we must emphasize the extent of resistance as well as the high number of unsuccessful attempts, unfinished projects, and bitter failures. Most of them are not even mentioned in history books. Our other concern was to free ourselves from the traditional colonial periodization which too often prevented us from understanding the specificities of colonial domination. First, it was appropriate to study the early modern and modern history together. This may seem very obvious to researchers from English and American universities, but in France, these two periods are tightly separated, to the point that very little research transcends the chronological boundary constituted by the French Revolution. Only this chronological depth makes it possible to emphasize the continuities between the 18th century and the 19th century, and thereby to denaturalize the differences between a so-called first colonial empire and the second colonial empire. It is a cherished idea of Mélanie Lamotte, one of the book coordinators. Moreover, historians tend to essentialize the colonial context by focusing exclusively on chronological milestones, beginning with the official conquest and always ending with independence. So most history books focus exclusively on the history of Algeria between 1830 and 1962, or Indochina between 1854 and 1858 and 1954. Historians have too often adopted, in fact, the chronological milestones set by the colonizers themselves. While on the one hand, the date of conquest most of the time reflects a fictitious appropriation. Algeria was not conquered, far from it, in 1830, and Laos is colored pink on French maps from 1893, while only a handful of French people are on the ground. On the other hand, independence does not always lead to decolonization. This is obvious for West Africa and Central Africa after 1960. This is why parts 1 and 5 are decisive to us for understanding the colonial phenomenon itself. The main originality of this work actually lies in this fifth part on societies before the European intrusion. This is what historians teleologically call the pre-colonial period. Reinserting the colonial moment into the long term of indigenous societies allows us to analyze the social, economic, and geopolitical dynamics that the colonial expansion interrupted or changed, and also allows us to better understand how they often maintain their tool of social regulation, like school, like justice, under colonial domination, forms of social regulation that the colonizer do not see or do not understand. This centering colonial history away from European perspectives invites us to observe the balance of power from the point of view of Asians, Africans, Arabs, and Native Americans. And by shifting our gaze, we observe multiple forms of expansionism in these different regions of the world. This makes it possible, without relativism, to try to decolonize Western colonialism. Europe does not have the prerogative of colonialism, even if it has developed a unique form of colonialism. But how can we identify its specificities without comparing it to other empires? So furthermore, this dive into the past reveals the existence of globalization processes before Western imperial and colonial globalization. For instance, the Austronesian colonization of the entire Pacific Ocean during the first millennium and after, or the globalization of the Indian Ocean during the 14th and the 15th centuries, within which European players were absent or played a secondary role. Finally, this fifth part aims to show the different ways of telling history in different regions of the world before the French colonization. From Kanak engraved bamboo to the skin of North American bison, including African oral traditions and Tamil chronicles. So to implement this ambitious project, we needed a tight team with knowledge of the different historiographies of the major region of the world for the various chronological periods considered. This is why I asked Arthur Asseraf, Guillaume Blanc, Mélanie Lamotte, and Yala Kisukidi to coordinate the work with me. We started working during the first lockdown in 2020. And as you know, academic research is not only a profession, it's rather a neurosis. So we spent entire days in 2020 in Zoom conference to structure the summary and to kill time. We brought together more than 260 scholars from around the world to develop a polyphonic history. I must say that collective books for the general public have become, in recent years, a sort of French specialty, like L'Histoire mondiale de la France, translated in American under the title France in the World, A New Global History. This work, published in 2017, met with huge popular success, largely thanks to the controversies launched by the far right in France. Thank you, Mr. Zemmour. And this, to my knowledge, it is the most adapted French history book abroad, with a dozen of adaptation in Europe countries. And I was one of the 4 coordinators of the book under the direction of Patrick Boucheron. And when I came to present the book at NYU in 2017, the reactions were very enlightening. Colleagues asked me questions that no one has raised in France. For example, how many blacks, Arabs and minorities among the authors? We then realized the very low diversity and the strong Parisian centrism of our team. So French colonial history, due to the infinite diversity of its sources, its archives, and the language concerned, could only be collective. Nearly half of the authors live and work outside Europe, outside France. Many colleagues Moreover, from French overseas were contacted, and this is very important because they are, for the most part, invisible in the metropole. We must say today the hexagon. And these researchers invite us to integrate previously obliterated events into national narrative, into national history. For example, regarding the West Indies, the historian Jean-Pierre Sainton shows in the book the importance of the social and political movement in Guadeloupe in May 1967, before the famous French May 1608. Or even the engineer and philosopher Malcolm Ferdinand documents the post-colonial chlordicone scandal. Chlordicone is, as you perhaps know, a pesticide used for banana cultivation that is very bad for health, and which was widely used from 1972 to 1993, while the French administration was aware of its great danger. So we clearly see here that the choice of authors determines the historical narrative, in this case by enriching it considerably. So to conclude, how can we make this history book accessible to as many people as possible? We have taken, in fact, the editorial formula from l'Histoire mondiale de la France, short text, 5,000 characters. There are case studies that can be read independently of each other, text without intimidating footnotes, with engaging writing. But unlike l'Histoire mondiale de la France, we have essays of 10,000 characters. These essays mostly evoke several colonial societies in different regions of the world. And in addition, we have written 5 broad-based syntheses of 50,000 characters, which offer a global vision of the subject, useful, I hope so, for students and teachers. So these different formats should allow readers to pick and choose. That's the principle. Pick and choose, gradually appropriating the historical material to ultimately form their own opinion. Thank you very much for your attention.
I wanted to say that the book actually is here on the table. It's not for sale. You can just look at it. You can have the organizers of the book. There are 4 copies. Put them back after you have good to them. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for organizing this and inviting us to present our essays and chapters. Thank you very much to Pierre Singaravélou, as well as the other co-editors, for their patience during the whole process, writing process, editing process, etc. And I'm really glad that you showed this quote by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, because it might seem like just like a neutral phrase, you know, la France a le deuxième espace maritime au monde. But this kind of statement is one that you can find like very regularly in the French public sphere, especially during presidential elections, as a way to show that our overseas territories really matter. And totally forgetting about the colonial past and present of these overseas territories. So my text in the volume opens a subpart of the first section of the book dealing with the traces of colonization. It deals with the contemporary era, and and about what happens after formal decolonization. It's a subpart that also opens a section that deals with the French overseas territories, known as dom-tom, even if there are more com today. and with the process of departmentalization. So my apologies to my students who are in the room because I keep talking about departmentalization in my seminar. And I start with the fact that in 2021, there was the 75th anniversary of the departmentalization law, which was not called as such at the time. It was a law of legal assimilation promulgated in 1946, and this anniversary went relatively unnoticed. People didn't really know about it, didn't really care about it. And at the exact same time, a number of French overseas territories, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyane, and others, were going through a very severe social and political crisis in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. From a very institutional point of view, the first aim of departmentalization was to bring the overseas territories out of the colonial status and into line with France's mainland France's institutional and administrative reality. Departmentalization was supposed to end the arbitrariness of governors who were replaced by préfets and who were directly answerable to the Ministry of the Interior. But the institutional transformation was very rapidly a disappointment, proved very rapidly disappointing. And a number of opposition started in several territories, including Martinique and Guadeloupe. And the support or opposition to departmentalization quickly became a very strong point of division in local political spheres. The thing is that in practice, this moment of departmentalization was followed by several other moments of institutional evolution in these places. And I will cite only two. At the very beginning of the 1960s, in a famous speech, famous in the overseas territories, the General de Gaulle said that departmentalization had to be transformed and become une espèce d'autonomie, a kind, sort of autonomy. And that paved the way to a number of important transformations. And another important step in these evolutions is 2003, a constitutional revision in France that kind of opened a new page by allowing a number of territories to have statut à la carte. That's why dom-tom don't really exist, because all of the various territories actually have different types of status, different type of prerogatives, depending on the wishes of local elected representatives, and with some greater autonomy in some areas. So these institutional questions that are sometimes very technical have evolved with time. But beyond this very institutional dimension, departmentalization also constituted a moment of strong transformation and reorganization of the relations between the state, the central state, and the societies in these territories. And these transformations can't be understood without really understanding this society on the eve of departmentalization. I often explain to my students that in the early 1980s, when the movie Rue Cazenègre was released, people from Martinique and Guadeloupe just, they just went to the movies. They flocked cinemas to see Azan Palsi's adaptation of this Joseph Zobel novel, because the memory of the very miserable rural life in Martinique, living in a society that was, whose social structure were so close to what existed in the mid-19th century, right after the abolition of slavery, was very vivid to people. So they would see on screen a life that their parents or grandparents had really experienced at some time themselves. Between departmentalization and the moment this movie was played in cinemas, a number of strong and important transformation happened in these territories. You had the development of a number of public services. You had higher levels of education, an increase in the number of civil servants in a number of these territories, improved material conditions for a large part of the population, a number of very visible transformations in the lifetime of people who had been living in these conditions that you can see in Azan Palsi's movie. And at the same time, you had this transformation of a society that was largely organized around plantations and the plantation economy towards a society of mass consumption and a society that was developing around an economy of services, but also the monoculture of bananas, which is a significant part of the reason there was this Claudican scandal. However, at the exact same time that all of these transformations were happening, a significant part of the population of these territories had to relocate, had to migrate toward mainland France via a policy of organized migration implemented by the Bumidom, which was a state agency that organized the migration of people from the Réunion Island, Martinique, and Guadeloupe towards mainland France. Because despite these improvements, despite the development of the role of the state, those were economies that weren't able to really produce enough jobs for everyone. And there was this general discourse of just go to the motherland and you will experience social mobility there, the social mobility that you cannot experience at home. To summarize, we have to understand that departmentalization as a very interesting case study of exit of the colonial moment without really reaching a form of political emancipation is a very interesting experience that existed in a number of those places. That it was a way for the people who supported that law to enable a number of people to get out of poverty, a very important poverty in these territories. It was a way to reach a form of equality with the mainland. And it's an issue on which I really insisted in the essay I wrote, because it's a very criticized decision. You know, departmentalization is very often seen as a way to kind of skip the question of independence, except that at the time you had like some very theoretical discourses on and political discourses on what are we going to become, but you also had very pragmatic questions that were raised by people, leaders such as Aimé Césaire or Rosan Girard around, okay, so what we are going to become is important, but it's also important that people have drinking water in these places. Departmentalization was followed by a number of other processes, deconcentration, decentralization, and all kinds of institutional tools that were used to bring about change in these former colonies since 1946. But overall, these tools lacked ambitious political direction. They also lacked effectiveness. And very often, and that's how I try to conclude this essay, we see that a number of the challenges in contemporary local politics in places such as Martinique and Guadeloupe and French Guiana and the Réunion Islands, now overseas territories, is to overcome that the belief in the central role of institutional change to reach both development, but also more generally political emancipation. That what we can see, and I really insisted on that in the conclusion, is that there's a difficulty to think about political projects in those places. And all political discussions are geared towards talking about what changes in Article 73 or 74 of the Constitution are going to bring about the changes much needed in places that remain among the poorest in mainland France, while being among the richest in their respective regions. And I also try, because that's a point on which I insist on pretty much everything I write, to show that there's a strong responsibility of the central French state in that, but also a strong interest on part of the political and economic elite locally in maintaining a form of status quo, and that's been the case for now more than 75 years. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank my friend Emmanuel, who basically pushed me to come. Because I'm unable to say no to her, and she knows it. So I would like also to thank Pierre, who associated me to this project. And it's interesting, this is the first time we are meeting, but we have been working before this project, actually. I wrote a paper for him long before this project. So this is a discovery. And for a historian, it's something interesting. So I contributed two texts in this book. And one paper is about Sarkozy's speech in Dakar in 2007. And Yela Tshisekedi asked me, and Pierre asked me to write a piece on the general history of Africa, which was published by UNESCO from 1981 to 1994. And the two, if you want, demand are interesting because they are intersecting, because it's about history, how we understand history, and how the territory of history has both a scientific and political territory, is actually, as he say, engaging with the present, what his colleagues Hartog and Bouchon are calling l'histoire à venir. And when I discovered the title of the book, Colonizations, Notre, histoire, I began asking myself, the Notre, who is the Notre? Is it all the people of the French Empire, or is it France projecting itself, Mélenchon, the maritime, in a larger world and capturing a group of people and making them French? And Sarkozy's speech in Dakar was about that. It was about a globalization which geography, it's a metropole and its colonies. But it's also about rethinking, returning to the mission to civilize. And for me, is that aspect which seems to me most important, because it's about, without shame, actually, advocating assimilation and negating totally probably all our, the legacy, the post-World War II legacy, which is globally appropriated in Europe in those periods. Because if you compare Merkel, Sarkozy, and Cameron, you have one huge push, is a push against communitarianism. It is a push against any idea, if you want, outside enlightenment, outside the reason, this very authoritarian and repressive understanding of reason. And Sarkozy's discourse is speech is very interesting for that. Against Westernization, he is talking about precisely those outsiders of history, but outsiders also of humanity. And this is an aspect which is very, it's also, if you want a celebration of modernization. He's pitting magic against reason, myth against reality, and of course, immigration against nation. And basically, this whole construction is a kind of construction which is actually, if you want, feeding a project, and a project which is a European, if you want, European Western project. And this is also a way of affirming in a very powerful way that history is the science of the West. History is a science of empire. And the reaction, in particular for Sarkozy, and we see it, and for France, we should see it today, is the crisis, which is the Sahelian crisis, and the discovery of another narrative, which is not the Western narrative. Is why even people like me, we are trapped. Is why it's true. The history they try to unveil is mine. But it's mine without being mine. It's what I try to show in this paper. If the choices Sarkozy he is annexing Senghor, but he is in an university called Cheikh Anta Diop. He didn't mention once Cheikh Anta Diop, the alternative to it. But he also showed one thing Césaire has said a long time ago, which is also probably how we are trapped as non-Western historian when we write history. Césaire says, l'Occident ne dialogue pas, l'Occident soliloque. I think it's a wonderful. When you translate it, it's not so nice in English. But he said that Europe doesn't dialogue. Europe soliloquizes. And I think that is precisely what Sarkozy came in Dakar to perform, and he performed it. And for years, I refuse to contribute to any book about this. I have never. This time, even I'm still asking myself, why did I do that? But yeah. Because I think somehow it's a waste of time. Because I don't know why why should I pay attention to Sarkozy? Even when he was president, he was not mine. And, but it's an important discussion, I think, intellectually. And what I try to do is compare what Sarkozy's project, if you want, at a given moment, and the project, which was the project of the African and non-African who were behind the writing of the UNESCO General History of Africa, which was decided in 1964, but implemented in 1974, when a Senegalese became the Director General of UNESCO. And what I try to show is who is included and who is excluded. For years, it was this monumental history, which was basically the foundation of research in Africa. But slowly, I began discovering that here also the project was very European. Though the scientific committee was an international scientific community, which was dominated by Europeans. You had, I think, one American and one Canadian, and 2 or 3 Soviets. But the project was based on an assumption that it was a scientific project. History as a science was the basis of this project. And one thing which is interesting, they excluded African Americans. You don't have one African American participating in this project. And it was a decision made by Africans and Europeans on one reason. Their history was too political. And it's interesting precisely to see the tension, which is the tension in these books, between the African American reconstruction of African history has a political act, and what Africans and Europeans were trying to do. But if we look also carefully at the genealogy, at the kind of biography of this intellectual project, it's linked to many conferences which were organized by African intellectuals, artists, and writers from 1956 to actually 1977. It's the Présence Africaine Congress and the festivals. And one thing which is interesting is history is at the heart of their discussion. Temporality, Pierre talks about how they reopen the space of history, which is no longer limited to the bounds of, if you want, empire or imperial history. The connection to Egypt became important, a way of actually jumping over a period dominated intellectually by what Mudimbe called l'odeur du père, the colonial library. They are also trying to open up the historical box by actually a kind of gesture allowing them to reimagine what the universal is. And it's not only, if you want, an engagement, which is an engagement of, if you want a political engagement, it's also a religious engagement. The African intellectual who had played the most important role in this discussion about history are African Catholics, African intellectual Catholics, because they were completely obsessed by one question, the question of the universality of the Christian message. How is it possible to turn that message into a universal one? How to meet what this message is pretending to be? And their response was simple. It was disconnecting the message from the European culture, from the European history. And it seems that these people were influenced the man who will become Pope John the 23rd. And this is why he convened the Council Vatican II. And that gesture is also impacting history and how history should be recomposed by if you want, by African history. And the other question, and is where the general history is important, is escaping colonization, jumping over colonization, which is, of course, as Ajay say, an episode in African history. Is why for Pierre, for whom this book is written, if colonization does not actually have the aspect we as historians pretend it has. Thank you.
So just a few comments on my paper that was called Racialisation à géométrie variable, published in the part 3 of the book, called L'Empire qui voulait être le monde, the empire that wanted to be the world. So we don't, I mean, I want to be brief because I want to have a break. I want everybody to have a break. And then have the second panel and have time for the questions. I would say, just as an introduction to my remarks, that the title in English doesn't work very well, right? Colonizations, our history. First of all, there is a grammatical asymmetry between the plural and the singular. That doesn't work very well in English, I think. It's my first time making statistic comments my entire life about something in English, because I do that in French, but in English I never dare doing this, but forgive me if I am wrong. Maybe I'm totally wrong. But I don't think it works very well. So here the asymmetry is also between the many modalities that the French people have had to colonize over the years, and this one history, right? This unified, or rather unified history that these modalities are supposed to have produced. Second reason why the title, I think, doesn't work very well is that in English, actually it works very well in French, but I was trying to understand, this is different. Well, it sounds a little bizarre in English, right? The very abstract notions of colonizations and history, and used here without qualifiers, right? Colonizations, our history. That work well. That work doesn't work very well, I think, in English, or less well than in French, in a title, because it does suppose, it seems to me at least, it does suppose some kind of conceptual stability, right? We know what colonization is, and we know what history is. And that doesn't sound right, right? First, we have so many forms of colonization, from settler colonialism to informal empire, and with a whole collection of prefix, right? The pre, the post, the decolonial. And so it feels like this conceptual unity is assumed in a way that is, in a way, problematic for us, right? We don't believe in that unity. The other is obviously the singular in history, right? That we are so used here, here in New York, in American academia, I suppose, in our day and time, we're so used to the idea of fragmented history, fractured histories, and the multiple perspectives on history, that it is even hard to say our history, right? To have this singular concept just pronouncing it here feels a little difficult. Finally, on a less stylistic and more maybe political level, the very phrase our history sounds a little bizarre, right? A little obsolete, maybe a little too French. It assumes, I think, that we can recreate something like a political community if we take stock of this history of colonization, which in France and elsewhere, but the book is obviously about France, a history that has traversed and continues to traverse both macroeconomic, social, political trends, but also the very grammar of our everyday interactions. So I think a lot of people here in this room and beyond this room, but here, would be reluctant to take that step, right? That we can recreate our history, that it is even possible as a project. So I want to hear Pierre more about it in the Q&A. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think that, to be very generous with a project, which I want to be because it's a magnificent book, not because I participated in it, but because it's a great book. I think that in these kind of ambiguities or difficulties, right, both in a way semantic and epistemological and maybe political difficulties, there is the idea, the very important idea, that there is a possibility today to recreate something like a common right? A community based on a history that has been and remains deeply divisive. So our history doesn't suppose a union or unification of this history. The history is posed as divisive, and a history that cannot be brought under a unitary narrative, but a history that has touched everyone with to diverse, in diverse ways, to different degrees, but something that has transformed us and maybe created something like a us. So I'm just saying this to explain what I'm doing, what I've tried to do in my piece on racialization. Like all the pieces in the book is extremely short, so that was a little frustrating to write. So with so few characters, of so few words. But I think it's trying to review a large swath of the literature on race and colonization in the French context. And for me, something that I want to reiterate from Pierre's initial comments, it's really a book about what we call in France vulgarisation, or popularization of very of a lot of work and research and kind of academic historical research, and make it available to the public for them to do whatever they want. And that's a very important function that doesn't really exist here. There are very few mediators between very few occasions to mediate academic history into the popular, not popular, but like the public discourse and public political debates. And I think that book serves that function in a very important way. So there were 5 points to my paper, which I don't know if I should summarize them. I will summarize them. I am the master of the time, after all. So in this paper, I said something like, we do tend to think of that racism and racial categories were invented somewhere in Europe during the Enlightenment, right? Something like in the 18th century, there was something like a scientific racism. Here I am kind of paraphrasing the historical common sense, right? And not what researchers say, but that's how we tend to think about it. And then this was actually the springboard for racism being exported to the colonies, to colonial situations, and for racial categories to organize, social relations of enslavement and dominations. And this is wrong. A lot of historical work in the past 20 years has debunked this idea. First of all, there is a very important line of work from Cedric Robinson and the whole reflection on racial capitalism to people like Jean-Brique Schaub, who have shown pre-colonial, right, pre-1492 at least, forms of racialization in connection with either status or with economic relations, in the case of Cedric Robinson, and showing the importance of modes of racializations of Jews and Roma in Europe, and how those have in part, only in part, but have in part shaped the way that racial relations were being articulated in the New World, especially starting in New Spain, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that I think is important to say, that this whole entire view that we have of racism as being predicated on so-called scientific racism, on the Enlightenment, on like kind of, a highbrow form of racial categories, actually was not that powerful, at least in colonial situations in the empire, in the sense that colonial domination was actually working with a both more crude and more subtle form of racism, in the sense that a lot of, it was like, they didn't need numbers and angles and all these things to, affirm forms of superiority, of hierarchies, but also there were many complex forms of euphemization and ways of hiding racial categories that we still live with, right? That are actually in our everyday relations. So that was one thing. Okay. What I wanted to say and what I mentioned in my short paper is the very large literature that has shown, on the contrary, how racial distinctions were the often contingent product of social interactions and local power relations in colonial situations, in a way that races are the byproduct of colonization and not the other way around. All of this you know, and so, I mean, you know because you're, many of you know that, at least because you're academics and you read those things, but it's very important, I think, to say this in the French context and to have people being persuaded of this history, because this is a history that is still with us, right? So it's important, for example, to see that in Algeria, when French people arrive in 1830, they describe a plethora of groups. They speak about the Moors, the Turks, the Jews, the Arabs, they also call people Negroes, and so on and so forth. And then 50 years later, you have a completely racialized and completely shrunk social universe with Europeans and natives, Européens et indigènes, right? And so there is this process of realization of which we're still part of, that is still with us in France, at least. So you need to understand how this process happened. And it was not, again, a projection from Europe. It is completely the result of of the history of accaparation of land and the history of institutions of dominations in Algeria. In that process, biology was not, I think, or even like bodily markers were just one part of that process. A large part were other kinds of systems of differentiation. Religion played an enormous role in the French empires, French imperial process of racialization. In Algeria, again, Islam became a race. I quote in my paper, and often with my students, this decision from 1905 from the court of Algiers, where you have a young man who is trying to actually get rid of the status of indigène musulman, of native Muslim, of Muslim native, because he wants to not be subjected to a whole series of, form of discriminatory measures against him and criminal laws, very specific system of criminal law that was applying only to the indigène. And this young man, who was Christian, who was the son of two Christian people, so we're in 1905, his parents had converted to Catholicism in 1868. In the context of the famine in Algeria, his parents had been orphans and had been taken over by, had been educated by Père Blanc, white fathers, and their son in 1905 goes to a court and is being told, you are an indigène musulman chrétien. You're a Christian, native Muslim, right? So there is this, you see here, I mean, so clearest example of the racialization, I think, of Islam in that context. Islam is not an identity you can dispose of. No free will, right? It's in your DNA. It's in your. It goes with you wherever you go. So that's another way that So beyond religion, there are other things. There are tons of institutions, social institutions that are produced race, and schools, military. Service, cities in colonial situations were organized around race. So you have social spaces in which racial categories become actualized, and also obviously the intimate, right, private relations, sex became places and spaces of racialization. Okay, in that process too, that's another thing I'm saying in my paper. It's not just the colonized that got racialized; it's also the French. It's also the colonizer, right? In a movement of reflection that, Césaire speaks a lot about, or when he speaks about the ensauvagement of the colonizer, there is a boomerang effect in a way, where that racialization is a multiple, involves all parts, right? So the French become a race. That's something I've worked on in my first book, but it's a general thing. And I think, in a way, we're still there, right? The nauseabund, the terrible smell of political debates in France today is completely the consequence of thinking about the French nation as a race. We are not out of there. And this is something that was invented somewhere in our colonization. So that's what I tried to do in this paper. And I think going back to this, to the title, or to the idea of this common history. what I think is important to say when we do this kind of work, again, which is a popularization of scholarship, is that without being shared, right, without being symmetric, without having a false sense of histoire partagée, right, of a shared history, it is still a history that has been lived and continues to be lived in different modalities, right, in modalities where violence is exercised in very different ways. But it is a history that is impacting, right, all people who live in France today, but also most people who live in the shadow of French empires. And in that sense, it is our history. So thank you. So I suggest a break, a short break, no questions. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for the second panel, and then we'll take questions then, okay? Thank you. So now we have the second half of our presentation. We will first hear from Madina Thiam, who is an assistant professor of history at NYU. Her work explores the circulations of West African people and ideas, social histories of Islam in Mali and the Sahel, Malian women's history, and Pan-Africanism. She's currently working on a book manuscript titled The Inland Shore, an intimate history of revolution and decolonization in Muslim West Africa, 1804-1960. Our second speaker today is Guillaume Calafa, who is an associate professor of modern history at Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne and a member of the Institut universitaire de France. His first book, Une mer jalousée, contribution à l'histoire de la souveraineté, Méditerranée, 18e siècle, was published in 2019 and is currently working on a book on shipwrecked Muslim pilgrims in Sicily in the 18th century, and he is a new editor of the Annales. So if you want to publish articles in the best French review, you can speak to him after the panel. Our fourth speaker today, a third speaker on this panel, is Youssef Ben Ismail, who is a historian of late Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East. He is currently a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows for the Humanities at Columbia. And sadly, he will soon leave us. I mean, sadly for us, but great for him, to become an assistant professor in the Department of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought at Amherst College. His research deals with law and imperialism in the 19th century Mediterranean, with a particular attention to the connected histories of sovereignty in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire. And his current book project, he has a book project, he's finishing actually a book on the French-Ottoman imperial disputes over the sovereign status of Tunis after the conquest of Algiers in 1830. Last but not least, we will hear general comments from my very dear colleague, Greg Mann, who has not published in the book, and that gives him a unique perspective to speak about it. Greg is a professor of history at Columbia. He's a historian of West and Francophone Africa, and his work has focused largely on Mali and the Sahel in the 20th century, with two very important books, one published in 2006, Native Sons, West African Veterans and Friends, and second in 2015, From Empires to NGOs in the West African Sahel, The Road to Non-Governmentality. So thank you very much to the four of you. And what I think we're going to do is just after your comments, Greg, we're going to open, if you don't mind, the floor for a Q&A with the audience. We're not going to have like internal conversations because we don't have that much time. So thank you.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to try to stick to the assignment. Short time. That's the goal. Okay. So the piece that I contributed for this for the collection was part of the part of the book that was coordinated by Arthur Asraf, and it's a piece that's called Fuir du Mali vers la Mecque, to run away from Mali to Mecca. And I'll come back to the title at the end of this short presentation. I'll open with a story first of one of the people who's briefly featured in the story. His name is Abdullah Ag Mahmoud. He's a man from Gao in northern Mali. We don't know much about him. We know he's born roughly the last decade, at the turn of the 20th century, last decade of the 19th century, early years of the 20th century. He's born in Gao. When he's a child, around the age of 5, along with his family and several members of his community, which is the Keladag Tuareg community near Gao, they start emigrating, leaving the area as the French colonial conquest and encroachment has sort of like, more forcefully penetrated this part of Hintel and West Africa and Mali. They leave, they migrate east, and they keep moving all the way to Mecca to seek refuge from French colonization. There, we don't know much about his life, but we know that he's educated, this man, Abdullah Mahmoud. He grows from a boy to a man. He's educated in the Hijaz. He settled in the city of Medina for a while. He later travels, studies under a number of teachers, and earns a living as a trader. You find traces of him in several spots around the Red Sea, in the Hijaz, in Yemen. He settled in Sana'a for a while. Also in other parts of the world. We know that he's in India. He studies in Benares for some time before returning to the Hijaz. And then eventually, in 1838, he reappears in his region of origin. He travels back to what is the French Sudan, a place that he hasn't known since being a child. And we know from French colonial records that he's, quote unquote, proselytizing, encouraging local populations to, like him and like his family, undertake this travel east towards Mecca, this Hijaz, this Hijra, to go east, to go to a land ruled by Muslims. And so the French authorities place him under surveillance, try to track his movements a little bit, brand him an anti-colonial agitator. And that's kind of what we know about him. I want to open with him to kind of highlight several things. So first, he's not the only one, right? This man and his story, it's actually part of a movement of people who, around the turn of the century, migrated east from West Africa, from today's, Mali, Niger, heading towards Sudan. Several of them settle in Sudan, the East African Sudan. Sorry, I should specify. And others continuing on to other places. It's a movement, a population movement that is noticed by the colonial authorities, right? So you have, for example, in 1907, you have a note that goes out of the Dakar office of the Governor General of French West Africa, where he notes that he has learned through French newspapers that thousands of Fulanis from the middle Niger, so the middle Niger is this area in central Mali, thousands of Fulanis might be migrating from the French territory and headed towards the Nile Valley. And he notes, I would be grateful for any further information you might have on this issue. And so this small note, it kind of registers the anxieties, I suppose, of colonial authorities in the early 20th century as they face a set of population movements that kind of trumps the logic of colonial borders and also kind of trumps perhaps the direction they were expecting these migrations to take. And so that's what I'm looking at in this contribution to the book. These eastward travels of West Africans towards the Nile Valley, towards the Hejaz. A number of them end up in other places, from Sudan, going to Arabia, going to Syria, to Jordan, to Palestine. And this is something that continues on for a while. It's something that several scholars have studied and have looked at. And what I find particularly interesting about this set of migrations is that it kind of helps us rethink when we think about territories that were under French colonization, when we think about the kind of reactions people had to colonization. For a while in African historiography, there was a debate that I think has been largely moved on from now between, exploring, on the one hand, forms of resistance, on the other hand, forms of collaboration, you have these migrations that represent, in a way of expressing the fact that people do not want to live under a certain type of new world being imposed upon them, under a new set of political rule, under rulers from a different religion, and so on and so forth, and undertake migration as a form of refuge seeking, as one might argue perhaps, at least for some of them, as a form of resistance, and also like any migration movement, it's something that then becomes, these migratory routes, become a way for people to earn a living, to seek a better life, and so on and so forth. It's important to study these for a number of reasons. One has to do with something that Pierre was mentioning in his intervention earlier, I think about temporalities, and explaining that it was important in the book to break away from classic periodizations of French colonization across the world. The logics that animated the migrations of these people and them wanting to go away from French colonial rule also have to do with different set of temporalities clashing against each other, right? Across the 18th and the 19th century, in the region that they were from, in that part of the Sahel, you had Muslim reformers, scholars, leaders, and revolutionaries attempting to, in a way, remake the world that stretched from the coast of the Atlantic to Lake Chad. The direction that they were looking forward, the way their world was oriented, so to speak, was looking east. It was not a world that was, that fit within the vision that empire had of them. And you see these two temporalities kind of clashing, right? This temporality of these Muslim reformers and leaders and this era of state building, of sovereign state building in the West African Sahel in the 18th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, clashing and rubbing against the temporality of European imperialism in hinterland West Africa. So I'm not talking about the coast, I'm talking about deep in the interior in that moment. And that is part of what animates not just their reaction to colonization, but their decision to go seek a type of life that fits better the types of epistemologies, the type of geographies, and the histories that constituted their point of reference in that moment. So it's something that is, clearly not studied enough, but I think gives us a lot of tools for recentering how Africans themselves saw themselves in that moment. Greg Mann, I entered this story through Greg Mann and his book, the second one, you should really read, well, both of them, but in the second book, you bring up this story and you bring up this very interesting statistics about census and about the number of people of, quote, Malian descent currently living, or at least at the time, I think it was from 2010, living in Sudan, which is twice as much as the number estimated of people of Malian descent living in France, which is not something that I think for many of us fits the kind of, again, geography and idea of migration and idea of which histories have shaped where people then, end up living and so on and so forth. And that also highlights for me the importance of looking at this different set of movement and about how people try to maintain the world that they knew by moving away. All right, I'll end it here and happy to talk in the Q&A.
So good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. As we follow the order of the book, I'm almost the last to speak, because as Pierre Singaravélou explained, the formal choice, which is also an analytical choice and an editorial choice made with this book, is to go back in time until the 15th century. I'm working mostly on the 17th and the 18th century. And strangely enough, Youssef will speak about the 19th century after me. So I don't understand that, Pierre. You have to explain to me. I would have loved to speak at the very end. I'll come back to this point, which I find particularly successful in the book, and which seems to me also to be an important historiographical and intellectual proposition. Firstly, I'd like to come back to the genre to which this work belongs. As Pierre said, for 15 years now, major historical syntheses in France have taken the form of compilations of short articles ranging from 1,000 to 3,000 words, contributed by a diverse array of authors. To some extent, these works have supplanted dictionaries and encyclopedias, which were very fashionable in the 1990s and 2000s. There are works organized by century, l'histoire du monde au XVe siècle, l'histoire du monde au XIXe siècle, that Pierre knows very well, l'histoire du monde au XXe siècle. Nothing about the 17th and the 18th century yet, but why not? Or by thematic works, often organized by dates and events, such as l'Histoire mondiale de la France, or l'Exploration du monde, or more recently, Les mondes de l'esclavage. And so these colonizations or histories like the colonial history of France, in a way. These publications enjoy a wide readership, including those interested in contentious subjects in the French public discourse, such as slavery, Les mondes de l'esclavage, and colonization. They are also utilized, and I think it's very important, by secondary school teachers in France, and are of interest to high school and university students. They are very useful to them, especially for the first years, the undergraduates. They also fulfill a demand for knowledge and curiosity, in a way. I speak as an editor of one of these books, so that's why. These works have evolved to become more nuanced, maybe less Parisian, and that's maybe there's a causality between the two. And the introductory chapters in colonization and the central section in Les mondes de l'esclavage, I don't know how to translate that, actually, words of slavery, offer a genuine historiographical contribution that was not the case, I think, in l'Histoire mondiale de la France, or less the case, or l'Exploration du monde. As an historian specializing in the early modern period, and more specifically in the early modern Mediterranean, I contributed two texts, both appearing in the final section of the book entitled The Words Before. One is quite short, about the notion of discovery as a legal instrument for dispossessing people of their lands, rights, and histories, and the other, a little longer, so the essay, the intermediary kind of essay in the book, deals with the Mediterranean before colonization, and in particular before the conquest of Algiers. I'd like to speak about the second text about the Mediterranean. This essay has two functions. The first is to recall historically that the Mediterranean world during the early modern period was marked by relatively equal and balanced economic, political, and cultural relations between the Western European countries and the Ottoman Empire. In these pages, I outlined the state of economic exchange, military conflicts, and cultural interactions within a region defined by significant interdependence. The other function is more historiographical. It raises the question of the very notion or concept of the Mediterranean as a substantive, as a noun, as a scientific and political invention at the beginning of the 19th century. How can we approach a space, a Mediterranean world, which was constructed by colonization and shaped as a subject of study directly or indirectly by colonial historiography? Furthermore, how can we navigate documentation largely compiled and structured during the colonial era? And that's a problem for early modern historians dealing with colonization, actually, kind of indirectly, but very concretely in the archives, in the archival grain, in a way. There is a great risk of projecting onto the history of the Mediterranean the retrospective illusion of European domination as a foregone conclusion. This theological prism of the colonial outcome has long been, and sometimes still is, dominant in the historiography of the Mediterranean, of the Ottoman Empire, and more broadly of Islamic societies. This narrative, still deeply ingrained in French politics and beyond, perpetuates the idea of an irreversible decline of the Ottoman world, with early indicators visible in the economic, technological, and cultural spheres during the 17th and 18th centuries. The military setbacks of the Ottoman Empire, along with the gradual shrinkage of its border in the 18th century, have often been interpreted as evidence of Turkey's failure to modernize its institutions, military, and taxation systems effectively. This enduring historical perspective was central to colonial endeavors, which frequently employed the rhetoric of backwardness, or in contemporary terms, the seemingly innocuous term of divergence that we find a lot in actual Mediterranean historiography, to justify the notion that colonized nations were somehow inherently colonizable. The historiographical challenge today is precisely to study the early modern Mediterranean as something other than a long, slow prelude to colonization and the formation of European colonial empires. This means restoring the balances and interdependence of the past. But it also means getting rid of certain categories, or at least being aware that the analytical and intellectual categories we use were forged during the colonial period. This is reflected in our choice of lexical terms, such as Mediterranean, so that's the main one, I would say. But I think also of legal and political categories. It is important to write corsairs instead of pirates, Ottoman provinces instead of Barbary regencies, North Africa instead of Barbary, and so forth and so on, captives instead of slaves, sometimes prisoners of war instead of slaves. And this has very concrete historiographical and political effects. So that's why I come back to the subtitle of the book, Our History, that does not really work in English. I didn't know that. I think it should be read in this light, in a way. Colonization is also our history because it is linked to the history of the historiographical debate of the historical discipline in itself. It is to this very difficult exercise of historiographical and analytical decolonization that I believe Colonizations is a very effective invitation. Thank you.
Hello. I would like to also thank Emmanuel for organizing this wonderful set of panels, and Pierre for including me in this wonderful project. Like Mamadou, we had never met before, so it's wonderful to meet you. We often say that you know, through books, readers travel, but I'm glad authors can travel a little bit sometimes as well through them. I'm going to speak very briefly about my paper as well. I'm very happy that I'm going after Guillaume because actually there's a lot of complementarity between our two essays. In fact, when I was first contacted by Pierre Singaravélou and Arthur Asraf, they told me that they were looking for a short piece in a subsection called narratives. And for them, this subsection addresses a methodological question. And the question, they said, was, how can we write the history of the pre-colonial? So I heard this methodological question, and I took it in an epistemological sense. What is it that we can and cannot know about the pre-colonial and its history? What is epistemologically accessible to us who live on the other side of the colonial rupture? And conversely, what is no longer within our reach as historians? So how can we write the history of the pre-colonial, or how can we know about the pre-colonial from our position on the other side of this cataclysm? And to address this question, I knew I wanted to write about the colonial lives of pre-colonial archives. I wanted to write about archives, and I wanted to write about how they were, the manifold ways in which French colonial administrators in North Africa manipulated, displaced, rearranged, and destroyed the archives of the territories that they occupied in this region, which belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and which I studied. In other words, I was interested in the ways that colonization also operated as an epistemic operation on the future. Colonialism restricts our ability to know things, and it restricts the ability of the colonized to know things. That is quite obvious. But it does so not just during the colonial period. It also acts on the post-colonial subject's ability to know things, and in particular on their ability to know things about themselves. So in that sense, those operations are still ongoing now as a result of those colonial manipulations. And so considered from this angle, the question, how can we write the history of the pre-colonial that this subsection of the book asks, can really be reformulated as, how does colonialism, something that we are told is over, still acts today on the possibility of the formerly colonized to know themselves? But I also know that this was a public-facing book and a public-facing project, and so I was committed to tell a story, a very short story, admittedly, one that is singular and that sheds light on these broader theoretical concerns. So I decided to write about one single manuscript, in fact, a manuscript that is located today in the French National Library, catalogued under the title, the rather dry title, I must say, Supplément Turc 1349. Maybe you've read it. No. One of thousands of so-called Turkish manuscripts housed in the library. And a note written inside the last folio of this manuscript in French states that it was stolen in 1837 in Constantine, a town in eastern Algeria, by a French captain named César Marulaz, an ordinary French captain, who participated in the sack of the palace of Ahmed Bey in 1837. Ahmed Bey was the Ottoman governor of Constantine, and his palace was looted during the conquest of the city in the broader context of Algeria's colonization. And so, let's call it what it is. Marulaz stole this manuscript, and he stole it in order to give it to his cousin, who lives in the town of Dijon in eastern France. Now, this may seem anecdotal, but in fact, it is part of a much broader phenomenon, one that is very much documented. And one would be tempted to say a systematic practice of the French army in Algeria during the conquest. That is, the act of pillaging, burning, and destroying thousands of manuscripts during the conquest, and hundreds in the city of Constantine alone. Again, it's a very well-documented practice, one that, in fact, was justified by French Orientalists at the time, with arguments such as, and I quote from one of them, Arabs would have done the same had they conquered Paris. A very sophisticated argument, as you can see. So, unsurprisingly, neither Marulaz nor his cousin in Dijon read a word of Arabic, nor Ottoman Turkish for that matter. And so the manuscript in question was interesting to them not so much as a text, but merely as a souvenir of the colonial conquest. In the metropole, there was a great deal of commercial appetite for these manuscripts, Oriental books, other objects, especially among the French bourgeoisie, and this interest included interest in looted Algerian manuscripts. But once they crossed the Mediterranean these thousands of documents and manuscripts looted throughout Algeria by the French army lost their textual dimension. They ceased to be documents, in a sense. They became artifacts of colonialism, floating objects, souvenirs of an Orient that is conquered, that is mysterious, and crucially, that is silent, no longer a document. And so the question one is faced with this encounter with Supplément Turc 1349 in the lofty manuscript room, Salle des Manuscrits of the French National Archive, or library, is, well, what kinds of pre-colonial histories of Algeria this document would have allowed us to write? And conversely, what silences has the looting of Ahmed Bey's library and dozens of other libraries produced? Mamadou Diouf was saying that history is an imperial science. And so again, we return here to the original question about the effects of colonialism on the future, on post-colonial Algeria in this case, and its ability to know itself. In order to have the full answer to this question when it comes to the manuscript, you'll have to read the essay. It's very short, so it won't be too much of an effort. But in a word, what is interesting about this particular text is that it is an 1819 copy of a 17th century, an early 17th century epistle titled Golden Fragments, in Arabic, Ash-Shudur al-Dhahabiyya. And the epistle was composed in Cairo by a local Egyptian scholar and intended to help native Arabic speakers of the 17th century to learn Ottoman Turkish, the official language of the Ottoman Empire, to which Egypt belonged at the time. In the chapter, I delve into the history of this particular epistle and its author, and I think about the significance of the fact that such a manuscript was in Ahmed Bey's personal library in Constantine in the 19th century. What that tells us about pre-colonial Algeria's place within an Ottoman Republic of Letters of sorts. It means that perhaps Ahmed Bey saw himself as an Arab Ottoman notable who belonged to a world, an imperial world, that included places like Tunis, but also Cairo, Damascus, or Baghdad. This Ottoman imperial frame in Algeria is one that French colonial and metropolitan officials and scholars actively sought to undermine throughout the 19th century. And they sought to undermine it in order to keep Algeria and North Africa away from the Ottoman world, to be able to better colonize the region. Mariulaz, of course, had no idea about the French policy to deny the Ottoman past of Algeria in particular and North Africa in general. He was just an ordinary military captain. And so he didn't understand what he was stealing and the significance of his act. But what I want to suggest is that the looting of Algerian libraries in general should be seen as part of a broader strategy to take control of Algerian history, and in particular to suppress its Ottoman past. Of course, one can only do so much just with one manuscript and with such a short text. It's an incomplete story. It's an imperfect reclaiming. But I think it is important to ask the question, what if we had access to the whole library of Ahmed Bey and Constantine? What if it hadn't been looted or destroyed by the French army? What kind of histories of pre-colonial Algeria would have been accessible, intelligible? And how do we measure this injury, this very colonial injury, in the present, that the silences of these archives from the Algerian standpoint register today in the contemporary period? Thank you.
My goodness. I'm going to be very brief. I hope to be very brief. I suspect that Emmanuel will help me to be very brief. Yes, okay, I'm even putting my timer there. Okay. Thank you to a patient audience. You know, at the end, you should all get a round of applause for sitting in these chairs for 3 hours, or 4 hours, or whatever it is. So let me just, I was going to say things about the individual papers, and I think that is not necessary. I think everyone has spoken very well for themselves. Thank you very much. That was very eloquent and lovely. But I just want to circle back maybe a little bit to some of the opening comments, because this book really does offer something to us, and it's worth kind of maybe, you know, revisiting where the process began, what now seems so many hours ago, right? Offering to us a kind of new history of France in an unexpected way, or a new way of understanding the history of the world. That is a large task, even for a book of nearly 1,000 pages. And I think that, you know, in reading it, okay, I didn't read all of it. I read a good deal of it. Okay, the book offers to us something that is quite useful. And my original kind of reaction to it was, I think, similar to Emmanuel's reaction to it. In fact, even before Emmanuel's reaction to it, I said, you know, what's it called? Colonizations, Notre, histoire. I thought, c'est pas mon histoire, moi. It's not my problem. I'm an American. It's not my. I have a different set of issues around that question, but they are not the ones necessarily represented in this book. Although I did grow up in a neighborhood called Algiers in the city of New Orleans on an avenue called General de Gaulle. So in some sense, there's a heavy imprint of like a Francophone world that is there, right? But I decided, you know, to be less churlish about it and to think of the Notre or nous as a kind of invitation, right? To take it as a spirit, in the spirit of invitation rather than the spirit of kind of a forced inclusion or inversely a kind of exclusion, right? And the question that it seems to me is posed in the introduction to the book, and it might be one to kind of, I'm going to reflect on in the future myself, is really whether, as a very self-consciously, methodologically historical project, right, whether the methods and the theory of history as a discipline can really serve the purpose that the book lays out for itself. Like whether the discipline and the practice is apt for the task of reconstructing the us, which is the kind of object or the aspiration of the book as I take it. Like it strikes me that as happy as I am to be an historian, no offense to people from other disciplines, I'm not sure that actually history can escape from its functions that Mamadou calls out in referring to history as an imperial science. So that struck me as a question that would be worth kind of reflecting on going forward. The editorial note of the book, which was launched in the slides that we began with, draws on that foundational work of historiography, you know, Marc Bloch's historian's craft, which uses that classic kind of metaphor of the reel of film that is running backwards, and is the most recent pictures are the clearest and most brightest, and the historian has to begin from the present to think backwards and to run the film backwards, and then unwinding the spool in the opposite direction from that in which the pictures were taken, the historian kind of proceeds in this analysis. And that is maybe one of the most striking things of the book as one reads it, or as you heard it today presented, is that it begins in the present and moves backwards in time. And that's a very interesting kind of operation. On the one hand, it makes a great deal of sense, because what is remarkable, what is perhaps unique, what is very particular at least about the French colonial presence, French colonization in Africa, is not what happens after independence, but it's not what happens before independence. It's not the colonization itself. It's what happens after independence. It's the durability of the forms of thought. It's the durability of the political practices. It's the durability of the kind of relationships that emerge. What makes the kind of French-African nexus unique is what happens after 1960, not what happens before 1960, right? And the book, in some ways, moves through that period in ways that are very useful. And I thought Audrey Celestine's paper made that point very beautifully. I can't sort of rehearse it here, but I so appreciated the paper that you wrote. And it touched on things I was struggling with even yesterday in my class to try to explain to my students. So thank you for the paper. Unfortunately, I didn't read it before class, I read it after class, but you know. But it opens the question of whether kind of departmentalization is truly a kind of an after in the colonial equation or the colonial scenario. And then Medina Cham's paper asked the question of whether really this movement of migration from the west to the east is happening during colonization, or is it happening really in the context of some completely different temporality, right? Which is certainly partly the case, right? Not exclusively the case, but partly the case. it's both a before and an after and a during, and I think it's often the worlds that are being lived and created and recreated that are coming into being, being brought into being during the colonial period, but are not the effect of the colonial period, that are maybe sometimes the hardest to apprehend. And I think that's the utility of Medina's approach in that particular chapter, is to try to think about that social phenomenon that is occurring, that is really independent of colonial rule, as happening at the same time, simultaneous to it, but that relationship is not a causal relationship, it's merely simultaneity. I think that the papers that follow, well, they've just been presented so well, right? So what Guillaume and Youssef have had to say, I can't really replicate. I very much enjoyed reading the paper, just like I enjoyed hearing those two papers. They're actually very elegantly written, which I also really appreciated. But they raise this question of erasure and what is lost, the worlds that are potentially lost to us, particularly the destruction of archives and so on and so forth, right? But we cannot sort of also forget the point that Emmanuel Sadat was making, that the colonialism is also a process of construction, and some of the things that are constructed are very durable. They might be noxious, but they are extraordinarily durable and resilient. But what's unclear in that, to go to, for example, to Youssef's paper, is in the context of the burning of archives, the selling off of others, their kind of dispersal around the Mediterranean world in the context of French colonialism, the difficulty that poses for the post-colonial states to kind of construct their own history, which is a point that's made in the paper, makes it difficult for the story of the Maghreb, as the story of anywhere else that fell under colonial rule, to tell a story kind of for itself, what Achille Mbembe would say, for itself, right? That is the story that is the hardest story to tell, and that all of us in different ways as historians struggle with. Hi, Diane, I'll call you later. Sorry about that. The question, to go back to the metaphor that Marc Bloch uses and is adopted in the introduction to the book, is whether those stories would be on the same reel of film, right? Is it even the same film that is being played, right? It's not entirely clear that is the case. But Guillaume Calafat's paper makes the point very nicely in the book that what part of the work of colonial rule, not only in its erasure of some of what it inherits, but also in its construction of new epistemological categories, part of the work of colonial rule is to make every discovery into a form of dispossession, right? The argument that you make in the paper. And therefore, every existing history becomes a kind of before for a colonial history. And I found that very useful to think with, and I want to end with that, and I hope I haven't been too long already. But I want to go to the penultimate chapter in the whole book, which is something I do actually know something about, which is in the before section, the oral text, the Kurukan Faga and the Dansulu Kalikano, the Hunter's Oath, the two kind of Mande charters, these kind of oral texts that you know very well, putatively of the 13th century, right? There's an interesting move. I said, what is it doing in this book? This book is about French colonization. We're talking about the 13th century. It's a whole other empire. It has nothing to do with this history, right? But these are texts that are our texts, oral texts, right? That are presented in Mande Khan, an African language, passed along, written down finally in Nko, in a kind of African alphabet that's created in the post-war period quite recently, right? And then they end up being brought into French at some point, and then people analyze them and discuss them in their sort of French version, right? Never in the African language version, right? Although working to correct that, but nonetheless, that's sort of the case, right? But so what's interesting there is, look, there's this kind of conscription of all the before into now a colonial history, right? So these texts, or whatever you want to call them, but these sort of oral artifacts of the 13th century are now conscripts into a history of a colonial world, of which they know nothing and were never a part. I mean, they are an imperial history in and of themselves in very many ways, into the present day, in a particularly kind of West African context. But they are brought into this world and they can't refuse it. And most people, the grand majority, only have access to them via the French language, right? So it is this durability, this kind of impossible disentanglement of the French language is sitting in the middle of this kind of scenario, which struck me, at the end. that we are now living in this kind of impossible disentanglement of what is supposedly kind of our colonial history. And I guess it's the work that's being laid out that Emmanuel and Mamadou and other people were speaking about, is like how to reconstruct that, you know, our or us or the we in a way that is kind of forward-looking but attentive to all these things that lie behind us. So I just wanted to leave it there, and I don't have questions to pose to each panelist, but I'm sure there are very many questions in the room, and so we should just entertain those. Thank you.
Merci. Ça marche? Is it working? Yeah. Pierre, you have to answer all the questions because it's your job now.
Thank you.
Questions?
Hi, thank you so much. It was very fascinating. I just have a very quick question. That's why I run. When is the English version coming?
So, Kaylin, it's a question for you, in fact. Kaylin is editor at the CUP, Columbia University Press.
Yeah, so I mean, I was just talking to Pierre about this, that, you know, the translations are really tough with such big texts. So I think, you know, thinking of an English version, it might not look exactly what, you know, you're thinking of the translation of the one. But certainly I'm talking to Pierre and seeing what we can do, and we'll see how that shapes up.
But if there is translator around, that might be useful.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing panel. And my question is regarding when I first heard the title Notre histoire, our history. To my mind, it was a kind of a reclamation of the colonized people speaking about their history and being connected as subjects of colonial violence to various degrees at different points of the world. But my question for you is, you mentioned that it's a very public-facing book. So to you, who is this us who's reading it? Is it, for example, an Algerian immigrant in France who's reading this? Or is it people who were formerly colonized across the world by France? Who is this us in your point of view?
Okay. Well, that's a difficult question. Well, I think that people read the book. Well, I hope that the people who read the book are all of these people who've been so interested in these questions in recent years and have been able to find novels, essays, programs, documentaries that were able to, you know, fuel their interests. There's clearly something happening in France, and it's been the case for at least, I mean, for several years. And it's probably easier today to read and get information on this issue than it was 20, 30, of course, 40 years ago. So I'm really hoping that it's not just, you know, our colleagues who are reading the book, even though I mean, I think that a lot of them should read the book for sure. But I really hope that all of these people who have a sort of genuine interest for family reasons, for social, political reasons in this question, just find I mean, consider that at least that they have the thing with all of these contributions that will respond, that will answer to part of their the question they've been wondering. I don't know if it's clear. But
Yeah, just a few words. I think we have to be very humble because, in fact, we want to reach a large audience. It's the Seuil, like the other major publisher in France, are talking about le grand public éclairé, the enlightened public, you know. But in fact, I think we reached the teachers, the students, and some young professionals. And in fact, it is the same thing. I did a TV series entitled Decolonizations on the same subject, but it was compare history of imperialism since the Sepoy War until today. And in fact, we reach around 5 million people, but it's the same, you know, the same target, in fact, because it was broadcast on Arte, you know, the European TV. It's a very cultural channel, so it's not a different social target than the first one, in fact. 5 million or 20,000 copies sold, it's a little bit the same, in fact, from a sociological point of view, I mean.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all these very useful talks. Mamadou, I was very interested with what you said about maybe I'm wasting my time to just have this response to Sarkozy, and what changed completely your feeling, because I was just thinking about what Toni Morrison says about racism. It is a distraction that lets you away and far from what you are doing, and just do what you are doing, and not just somebody will say you have not history and you spend your time. We have history. Somebody says you are not well shaped, you have not good genes, and you spend your time saying you have. And there is always be something else. And you said maybe I'm wasting my time to write these people to respond to Sarkozy. We will never read it, of course. And you changed your mind and you wrote this paper.
Actually, I didn't change my mind. Because what has happened is my first reaction was a reaction based on one thing, why my colleague did not leave the place when Sarkozy was talking. And why, 2 months, 1 year later, they began writing all these things. For me, it was my first question. My second is that I have actually the same reaction than probably the person I admire the most, Toni Morrison, because when she said that, at the same time she is saying, okay, the fact is racism is the environment within which probably what define the Black person culturally is derived from. So, and that tension, which is interesting, because when you again compare, when we say, is it our history? When Africans began writing their history, they began writing for pre-colonial history. They were absolutely not interested in colonial history, and it's up to my generation is true. After my generation is over, now people, it's about the decolonial, something which is absurd, but it's what people think that is what defines today former colonialism. But the interesting aspect, and is one of the discussion we have been having, and it's also what Senghor and Césaire have tried to do. And again, if you ask them, what do you share with the French? What makes you? He will say, because you have two Frances, the kind of ideal France, of ideas, of a kind of universal quote unquote France, but you have a historical France, which is always contradicting and destroying what they believe is the real France, is what we share, if you want. And it's also what makes Sarkozy a kind of very marginal, person, because you can say, okay, he's coming from Hungary, so what does he know about France compared to a Senegalese who was part of that? And I think that we live in this tension, if you want, where we are trying to figure out how to deal with those multiple legacies and how to deal. And in my personal case, it's funny because I was born French. I am no longer French. And I can claim things, whatever. But the interesting aspect is what is the space which is offered? Is this book finally coming to bring another way of thinking? Because the first problem I think the French have is they reduce France to the immigrant, the African. They really believe that all black people in France are French. Or I believe that the majority of them are not African, but they are black.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question just about the place of the fifth section in this book, the section on kind of the before colonialism, eve of colonialism. I guess what I'm wondering is, it seemed like from the sections or the articles that were being presented from that section, that there's on the one hand this idea of this colonial rupture, that there are texts and manuscripts and other artifacts that are they're resignified under colonialism. There are things that are lost in the archive, but then there's also kind of other ways of imagining and other kind of systems of knowledge, and fragments of which seem to persist under the colonial regime and after it, and that people turn to in the context of nationalist movements and so on. And so I guess I'm curious, like, how that you thought about that placement of that fifth section. Like, is the idea to kind of think about both rupture but also vestiges that remain, and what does it mean to kind of think about the pre-modern and the early modern, but with this framing of a kind of history of the present that's beginning from this perspective of empire and French colonization?
Tu veux commencer? Yes. Yeah, I think c'est pour distribuer la parole un peu, tu vois. Bon. Yes, totally right. I think the first idea was to highlight the continuities between the so-called pre-colonial period and the colonial domination. It is very fruitful expression by Georges Ballandier. He was talking about the doublage des sociétés autochtones, le doublage des sociétés autochtones, the capacity of almost each colonial society to keep their social regulation. I talk about school, justice, etc. And it's impossible to identify these social regulation if you don't study the period before. So that's the main question for us. The other thing is, you're right, there is an intimate relationship between the fifth part and the first part, because the fifth part is a very epistemological part about the question of how do you write history. How do you write history? That's why you have to talk about the Monday chart and the way you see the link between the two parts, the way how we rewrite history after the independence, and the idea of a golden age before the colonization, etc. The reinvention of this golden age, etc. Yeah. So there is the two dimension in this part.
Maybe I can just partly answer that as well. I mean, what's interesting about that part for me, is that, and I think Guillaume's paper speaks to that, is that really when you're doing pre-colonial history, you're doing colonial history because you're necessarily engaging with the only possible, the only rather available narrative of that period, which is entirely, we are discovering increasingly, overdetermined by a colonial agenda, political, contemporary and past, and by a vocabulary. And I think that's why Guillaume's paper is enlightening, by a vocabulary that steers inevitably in fundamental ways conversations about the pre-colonial. And so on the one hand, there is a decoding that is necessary, methodologically possible, perhaps. I think the question is open. And then there is also something else which goes back to the first question, which is, and I will speak for myself here, the tension between, on the one hand, a Fanonian injunction to leave Europe, almost metaphysically, quitter l'Europe, in the conclusion of the Wretched of the Earth, right? Not think about it too much. And on the other hand, something that is of the nature of wanting to say to today's metropole also, colonisation, votre histoire. Because let me tell you something about formerly colonized populations. They don't need to be reminded of the continued agency of the colonial in their history. They don't need to do that. Right. So I think, and I thought it was a very important intervention, this Notre histoire, because it is a generous way to say votre to people who might not think of the colonial as something that is operative in the present. And I don't know how much that was an explicit aim in the project. I certainly read it in this way.
Hello. I was just wondering two things, but I think they relate one to the other. Mainly the title of the book, Colonizations, Notre histoire. Histoire already connotes this type of past sense. So like we're looking at the past of what happened. And I'm wondering to what extent are we actually talking to something that is very relevant to our days? And maybe it's something that is not inherently just stuck in the past, but it's continuing. I think precisely about when you started presenting the situation in Africa as the book was starting to come out, just shows that it's not something that has ended. And I also think about the dom-doms and the coms and how the situation right now in Kanaki proves that colonization by the French is still very much alive. So how does that operate for you guys as you were writing these histories of the past? And also maybe a sequel could be titled Colonisations, Notre réalité. Just an idea, but I think it would be a good thing to discuss. At the same time, along that same line, I wonder what the reaction of particularly the French right would be to a book like this, or to a book that would consider it as a reality.
The reaction from whom, sorry?
From the general public.
Ah, yeah. Oh, that's very interesting, yeah. You want to begin with the first part?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll jump in because I had part of this interrogation, Alejandro, when it came to the title of the text. I initially submitted, I think, something that said Du Mali à la Mecque. And then as part of the editorial discussions, I think there were too many, from this to that titles in the book. And so it was suggested La fuite des Maliens vers la Mecque. So the Malians running away towards Mecca. And we were talking about earlier about who's reading this, and I really try to remove any French reader from my head whenever I'm writing anything. And I was, working on it. But I was trying to, I really tried to think hard about, if there's a Malian reader, and I know these categories are far from being exclusive, I'm sitting here right now, but if there's a Malian reader picking up this book and reading this as the, La fuite des Maliens vers la Mecque, is this something that they would want to read in the present? Is this something that they would want to see represent, is this something that would really represent the text and what it's trying to do in terms of, I suppose, putting back to the fore a certain type of history that is less well known? This is going to be something that pushes away a lot of Malian readers, right? Because it's this idea of of running away, of escape, of and yeah, it's one of those little things that I obsessed over for a matter of several weeks. This is a book that's meant to be read in the present. It's meant to reach a number of publics. These kind of like perhaps minute choices are also very important, right? And so we had this discussion about maybe it's not them running away, so on and so forth. But I think, as you're saying, yeah, it's not. I mean, and as has been exposed, I think largely today, it's not. These things don't land in a vacuum. Given the environment, today in Mali, in the Sahel, and things like this. And I sure hope, I don't have, I mean, publishing world is what it is. It's not a book that's going to be widely read, in West Africa. But I sure hope that if those readers who do make their way to this are not repelled by what they see, I think that's something that will be very important as well.
Yeah, just on the second part of the question, about the reaction of the right wing and the far right wing in France, that's very interesting because in September, October, December last year, we enjoyed a great reception, media reception. For instance, 2 pages were dedicated to the book in Le Monde, 3 pages in Libération, 3 pages in Télérama, etc., etc. Only one newspaper didn't write an article. It was Le Figaro. Le Figaro, and why is that? Le Figaro and also all the other, far right magazine and newspaper. Why is that? I think there is a very sad reason. I think that's the difference with the l'histoire mondiale de la France. One of the differences between 2017 and 2023 and 24 is that I think that the far right and the right wing considered that they won the cultural war, the cultural battle on colonization. They don't need this subject for their agenda. That's finished, for them. That's why I show you the quote of Zemmour, Fillon, etc. That's I think that's not an issue for them, and that was an issue for them in 2017. Something changed, I think.
And they are afraid of controversies because they would help the book, l'histoire mondiale de la France, or even l'exploration du monde about discovery. They had these nasty articles against the books, and that created also public debate. They want to avoid that now. And maybe about the audience, a little thing. I think it's very important to think of the high school teachers who buy this book and who also help to put into the programs some new ideas. I will come back to the Ottoman Empire, especially because in the French program in high school it's only 1.5 hours, so it's very, very small. When you are like 3 years before the baccalaureate, the end of. So it's very, very small. While actually for the history of Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, it's so important, and so just trying to write this history minus Europe would be something quite important. And I think this book can help quite indirectly to change the program of high school. It's quite optimistic because there are political choices, but they can help to put these topics to the historical agenda for high school and middle school also. So that's an indirect way to address also, the Algerian immigrant, as you said, or others.
I would like to ask a question to Pierre, because I think what is interesting in this discussion is sometimes we say, okay, but public doesn't know what about colonization, and as Pierre said, they made the right choices about what to talk about and what to avoid. But one word which is circulating in the French press is colonization. They don't want to be colonized by the black people who are coming. So they don't know, they know what it is. I'm sorry. sorry, they know what it is, and they are making choices based on that. When they say we don't want to be colonized, they are saying we are going to colonize the other, but please don't show up. And this is something to address, I think, if we want to make some progress.
I'm taking the last row of question, maybe all together.
First, thank you for such important work and richly vital scholarship. And I haven't had to read the book yet, but I wondered if you also sort of address the role of France in the establishment of other colonial regimes. I mainly think of Israel and its maintenance. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all so much for your panel today. I had a question related to Medina's talk, because in the talk you illuminate this other organizing system of migration that's happening eastward at the same time as the colonial era. So I'm wondering if there are a lot, obviously this edition is huge, there's so many authors and essays. Are there opportunities in the book for readers to see colonialism as something that's totalizing or something that is happening with other interlocking systems of organization, whether it be religion or migration or local and regional leadership?
That's a question mostly for Pierre. You made a choice to have very, very short essays. And I was just like leafing through the book and I was like, oh my God, where do I start? And I felt like before I start an essay, I'm already done. So why did you make that choice? You have so many voices, which is wonderful, but it seems like I think probably a lot of the authors are sort of a little frustrated by not being able to write more. Is it to make it more accessible to the public?
Or sadism, or
I
don't know.
Hi, thank you. So I think it's really interesting that this book regroups a vast majority of different experiences, different societies. But I'm wondering if there is, some people might think that as a result of colonization, that sort of negates the differences and uniqueness of each society's history, but I also am wondering, I don't know if this makes sense. Like, for example, in some texts that we read, they say Outre-mer, and they include Réunion, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and they talk about this as this vast entity without acknowledging the differences and the uniqueness of each place. So I'm wondering how you think about your text as a way of, is it, a sort of maybe revindication of this formerly colonized societies coming together, or does that risk sort of operating in the same way? I don't know if that was clear.
So I'm going to quickly answer the last question, maybe. Well, my take on that the use of Outre-mer, for instance, if we follow that specific example, is the use of a category that, even though it doesn't really represent the wide diversity of the various societies, French Guiana and Wallis et Futuna don't have much in common. But they do have in common the fact that they are all gathered under a political and administrative category, and that it does have an impact in terms of the type of public policies that are being decided, the type of agenda that's being decided for these territories. And I think that in the way we write about that, the fact that we say, well, these societies are different, but they are also subjected to a certain type of dynamics that I'm going to describe. It's precisely the work that we have to do, assess the diversity of these societies along with the type of processes they're being subjected to. So that's the way I try to reconcile the very difficult use of the term outre-mer for me, while it's central in my scholarship.